Hi, hello, and welcome to my second channel. I'm probably going to give you way more information than you need to know, but because this is my first video on this channel, I'm going to make it brief, but I want to kind of explain. Basically, this is going to be purely for book content, and I'm so freaking excited about it. Last year, I actually rediscovered my love for reading. I used to be a really big reader when I was younger, and I kind of just, I don't know, adulthood got in the way and I stopped reading. Last year though, around July, what was it? It was the whole like Colleen Hoover hype. Everyone was talking about Colleen Hoover, so I was like, okay, I need to read this book. So I read a few of her books, and although I didn't particularly love those books, it did kind of like reignite my love for reading. So I've been reading a lot ever since, and there was actually a good two to 3 months where I posted nothing but book content on my other channel. And I'm gonna be honest, it did not do very well. And I think that's basically because although people in general are multifaceted, we all love more than one thing, YouTube doesn't like that. I accidentally put myself in kind of a little bit of a bubble with my other channel, so anything that I kind of try to do outside of that really struggles. And reading is something that I know I want to do a lot of content on. I've literally already planned out a video a week for the next 3 months for this channel. My other channel's doing decent, it's monetized, it's yada yada yada, so I feel like it's kind of risky and maybe potentially stupid for me to start a whole nother channel, but I don't know, I'm really excited about the idea, so here we are. The first couple of weeks of January, I barely read anything. I think I only read like 3 books maybe, and then the other 2 weeks I just was flying through them. So I did read 10 books, and there is definitely like a mixed bag of different star ratings, but the highlight of the month is I found a whole new genre that I didn't really know existed, and it is now potentially my absolute favorite, but we'll talk about that at the end because I discovered it at the end of the month. But anyway, first book that I read this month was Book Lovers by Emily Henry, and I basically read this book because I feel like Emily Henry is also another author that gets a lot of hype. I ended my year last year with reading, what's that called? Beach Read, which I liked decently enough, but a lot of people I feel like compare Beach Read to The Roughest Draft, and I definitely preferred The Roughest Draft. But because I was doing kind of more of a comparison, I wanted to give Emily Henry another shot, so I read Book Lovers. I'm pretty easy to please in general when it comes to reading. I'm not like a really critical critic. That being said, I did originally rate this book at a 4-star, but when I was making my notes the other day and kind of like looking back on the book, I couldn't honestly really remember what it was about. So I did end up changing my star rating to a 3. Really the only thing I can kind of remember from the book is I thought it was interesting that the female lead is kind of like, her shtick is basically that she's the opposite of what your normal kind of like lead character in a novel is, like a romance novel. I think they actually referenced her as being like the type that's like the one before the one, and I thought that was kind of an interesting twist. However, her character was kind of different, but the theme of the overall story was generally the same. And basically it's kind of like one of those forced proximity type of romances where she's with her sister in this small town, and they're rival authors kind of, and so he actually lives in that small town, so they end up running into each other, and then, you know, the story blossoms from there. I don't know, so far I feel like maybe because Emily Henry has gotten so much hype, in my opinion, like I feel like a lot of people really like her books, like I said, I think I was just expecting more, and I feel like I read a lot of really good romance novels last year, so in comparison to those, these ones are just, you know, they're all right. They're decent. The next book that I read is called Other Birds by Sarah Addison Allen. I am subscribed to Book of the Month. I don't get books every single month because sometimes there just aren't any that interest me, but I almost got it, and so when I saw it in the library, I decided to pick it up because it sounded interesting to me. It is a magical realism style book, which I didn't even know was a thing. Movies, TV shows, books, if it has magic involved, I'm there. With that being said though, this book, even though it's categorized as magical realism, hardly had any magic in it at all. Basically, this book started off so promising. It's about a girl who, I can't remember her name, but she inherits a apartment in the Delawisp, which in the book is described as an old cobblestone building shaped like a horseshoe, and it essentially has like a few like apartment buildings inside of it, and it was named the Delawisp after these little blue mischievous birds that live there. And I don't know, the whole setting of the book just sounded so magical, and the character herself, the main character, She actually has like an invisible bird, and the other like neighbors that live there are all kind of like kooky and things like that. So it started off with so much promise. If there was more magic involved, I think it would have been more exciting, but there wasn't like a whole lot of plot to the book until the very, very end. And the majority of the book was just you kind of like getting to know the characters or the other people that live in the Delawisp. And they all seem to have this like trauma-filled past, and that's not really something I particularly care to read about if it's too kind of like realistic. Next up we have Lunar Love, and I actually do have this physical copy. This is actually a book that I did get in my book of the month, and this is basically about the owners of two matchmaking companies that match people according to the Chinese zodiac, but they do it slightly different. The female character in this story is kind of like an in-person matchmaker, and she's like very strict to the Chinese zodiac, whereas the male lead character has an app, and the app kind of just very loosely uses the Chinese zodiac. And they basically are very strong-willed on their way is better, so they end up making a bet that they can match each other using their method. And I feel like that plot line could have been so good, like having them set up each other's dates and things like that. I feel like it was a good opportunity to kind of build some like tension and stuff like that, but I don't know, that part of the story just kind of like barely happened. For me, my favorite part about romance novels, and the reason I love romance novels, is because I love that like building of tension between them. So that's kind of like the biggest downfall I think for me with romance novels. If I don't feel like they're actually like wanting each other, I guess it just kind of falls flat for me. But also the lead character has that personality type that just personally irks the ever-living daylight out of me. Basically, when someone is like so one-minded about something or someone that no amount of reason or action like sways their opinion until they end up doing something like rash and impulsive and mess up something, and then that's kind of like the trigger for them to be like, oh, you aren't that bad of a person. When characters are like that, I just find myself like irritated while I'm reading, and that is not why I read. I don't want to feel irritated. Like to a degree of like feeling something while you're reading is a fun thing, but like if I'm just irritated at a character, I don't like it. And then the other thing that I didn't particularly care for is just like the writing in general, or more so like the dialogue between the two characters. I feel like was very cheesy. Like I don't feel like people really talk the way that the characters talked in this book. It kind of gave me like sitcom vibes. Overall, I did give it 2 stars, so it just wasn't for me. The next book, or the next 3 books really, that I read were The Inheritance Games, which is a trilogy, and this is where the star ratings fly back up, or just fly up, I guess, because so far we haven't been doing too well. I am going to be talking about the series as a whole because there's 3 books, like I said, and I think I read them within 3 to 4 days, so I just kind of was like back to back to back reading them, so I don't really remember where one started and the other one began. But I did star rate them in my Goodreads. I do have a Goodreads, by the way, but I did star rate them as I finished them. So for the first book, I did 4 stars. The second book, I did 5 stars. And then the third book, I did 4 stars again. Basically, this story is about Avery, who essentially inherits this billionaire's entire estate, his money, his businesses, his mansion, everything. And in doing so, he essentially disinherits his entire family. So obviously that leads to a lot of confusion on Avery's part, because she's like, I don't know who this guy is. Why did he leave me billions of dollars? And then his family is obviously not very happy, except his grandsons, who kind of see her as a puzzle, because the grandfather, the guy that died, the billionaire, he basically was a really big fan of like puzzles, not in the sense of, you know, the ones that are come in a box that you piece together, but more so like, here's this old wooden box and you have to figure out how to open it, and then when you open it, there's like a clue that you have to go, you know, find a trap door somewhere, like that kind of thing. And so his grandsons kind of grew up with him always giving them these like challenges and these puzzles to figure out. So they see her as his last puzzle, essentially. So that's kind of like the basis of like the first novel and kind of like the buildup of the story. Obviously, a ton of different stuff happens. There's all kinds of twists and turns. Some of them were expected, some of them very much were not. And it was really, really exciting and fun to read. Also, there is a little bit of like a love triangle situation between Avery and 2 of the grandsons. If you've read the stories or you're currently reading them, are you Team Jameson or Team Grayson? I, from the second he entered the story, was 1000% Team Jameson. After reading the second book, I actually ended up looking at some of the reviews on Goodreads, and I was actually shocked by how many people, like I feel like the majority were Team Grayson, and I truly do not understand. It's So I'm very curious to see like what side of the fence you're on. The next book that I have is What Alice Forgot, and I don't know the author because I didn't write it down. I've actually seen this book 2 separate times in 2 separate thrift stores, which I thought was kind of weird. And then a couple weeks ago, I was at the library and I ended up seeing it on the shelf. So I was like, okay, clearly this book needs to be read. I was kind of hoping, since I'd seen it so many times, that it would be like fate. It would be my new favorite book, but that was not the case. I ended up rating it 3 stars. It was decent. This book is essentially about a woman named Alice who ends up knocking herself out on her spin bike. And when she wakes up, she has like a severe case of amnesia, essentially forgetting the last 10 years of her life. Can you imagine the horror of waking up and realizing you have lost 10 years of your life? Basically, she wakes up thinking she's still 29 and a newlywed, pregnant with her first child. And in reality, she's 39 in the middle of like a brutal divorce and has 3 kids, none of which she remembers. And the whole like divorce thing when she first wakes up was so heart-wrenching to read because the last thing she remembers is being madly in love and now they hate each other. So she's like kind of grappling with that. Ugh, it just ripped my heart out. I feel like honestly this should be maybe like a 4 star. 3.5. We're gonna bump it up to 3.5 stars because as I'm talking about it, I'm realizing I liked it more than I think I thought originally. For some reason, sometimes I'm like really loosey-goosey with my ratings. I'm like, everything's 5 stars. And then other times I'm like oddly strict with my ratings. Honestly, the only reason it didn't get a higher rating was because I distinctly remember reaching about halfway into the book and realizing nothing had really happened yet. So basically, I feel like the book just was too long. It actually ended the way that I was hoping that it would when I first started reading it, but by the time I got to it, I didn't care anymore. So it just kind of was a very lackluster ending for me as well. So I think that's why I honestly rated it a 3 stars. Last but not least, A Touch of Darkness. This was by far my favorite books that I read of the entire month. This is also the new genre that I've discovered, my new favorite genre, which is essentially spicy, smutty fantasy. Currently there are 3 books in the series and I literally just finished the 3rd one a couple of nights ago. For this one in particular, I don't have individual star ratings for the books like I did for the Inheritance games, but I feel like overall we're just gonna give it a 5 stars. Actually, we're gonna give it 6 stars because literally my new favorite genre. All I want to do is read more. This series is basically a modern retelling of Hades and Persephone. I don't know the original story of Hades and Persephone, but like, I love this one. I'm gonna kind of talk about these the same way that I talked about the Inheritance games, where I'm just gonna kind of talk about the general plot of like the first book and not really go into any detail about the other ones because I don't want to spoil anything. But basically, this is about Persephone, who is the goddess of spring, and her mom, Demeter, kind of kept her hidden away from the world, and so her powers never really were able to develop. And basically because she didn't really have any powers and she was so sheltered, she wanted to kind of experience life and see if she could be better at being a human than a goddess because her powers weren't working. And somehow she was able to convince her mom to let her live among the mortals and try her hand at going to university and getting a job and those kinds of things. All of this is not a spoiler, by the way. This is all kind of like preliminary. You kind of jump into the book getting a brief on all of that information. So when the story actually starts, Persephone has basically just gotten a job at a newspaper because she wants to be a writer, and to kind of like celebrate, I believe, her getting that job, her and her best friend go to a club that is owned by Hades, and through a series of events, she basically ends up accidentally getting herself into an unbreakable contract with Hades, which, by the way, if you've ever seen Lucifer on Netflix, Hades gives me, at least in the beginning of the story, Hades gives me very like Lucifer vibes. And obviously there is a series of books that is still continuing, so there's plenty more to the story, but that's kind of like the setup for it, and it is so freaking good. That being said, the only thing that I didn't really care for in the first book specifically was Persephone herself. She also has that same personality trait that I talked about in the Lunar Love, where she's just so focused on what she thinks she knows about Hades that like no matter what he does or what anyone says, she's just like, no, he's a jerk, I hate him. That gets kind of annoying after a while. You're like, can you pay attention to what's going on around you, please? I'm reading over my notes to make sure that I'm not like forgetting anything. And another thing that I wanted to point out that I didn't care for as much was, like I said, these books are very smutty, lots of stuff going on in them. In the 3rd book, it got a little boring actually because it was happening so often. Essentially, anytime Hades and Persephone were together, that's all that was going on. There was no dialogue, hardly. There was no like other storyline. It was just, I do feel like the tension that usually is there between the two kind of got lost. But the third book did leave off on a pretty big cliffhanger, so I'm very, very excited for the next book. Like I said, there's currently 3 books in the series, so the 4th book comes out this year in September, and I'm not sure if that's going to be the last one or not. But in the meantime, I also did just recently find out that there's actually like, what's it called? Like a sister series to this series where it's the same story but from Hades' perspective, which there is only 2 books in that series currently, so I don't know if it's like book for book or how that's going to work out, but there is 2, and a 3rd one is on the way this year as well. And with that, those are all of the books that I read in January. I have already checked out a small little pile of books, but to be honest, I don't really care about reading the majority of the books that I checked out, because now that I've read the Touch of Darkness series, all I want to read, like I said, is more spicy fantasy, which is actually perfect for February. That kind of leads me into my February TBR, which I wanted to go over really, really quickly. I do plan on reading the ACOTAR series, which I didn't realize was spicy. The Vicious Boys series, which is like a Peter Pan retelling, which sounds really, really interesting. The Never After series, which is also more kind of like Disney retellings, but they're spicy apparently. Also another series that was in pretty much every single video recommendation for this category that I watched was the Plated Prisoner series. And then obviously the Hades spin-off series, which by the way is another reason why I love this genre, because they never seem to have just one book. It's always like a series of books, and when I'm like really invested in a story, especially like a romance type of situation, I just want it to keep going on and on and on. Anyway, I think that's everything that I have to say for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you're interested in following along with my book reading journey, go ahead and subscribe. If you want to see more of kind of just like lifestyle content, like I mentioned in the beginning of the video, I'll leave my other channel link down below. And yeah, I think that's everything. I hope you have had the most amazing of days, and I will hopefully see you guys in my next one. Bye guys!